of the textbook is really it's an overview and better stated a review of information that we've covered in previous classes. As you'll find, most of the information was covered in BA 101, Intro to Business, and BA 131, Business Technology. So I'm just going to reemphasize a couple of the important aspects of the chapter. This is one chapter. You can probably skim read through it and you're fine because there's really nothing earth-shaking. Now, if you haven't taken BA 101 and BA 131, then by all means, read through in detail because this is good, solid, foundational information. Anyhow, so let's get started. Some of the terms you'll hear tossed about with manufacturing, and this applies to e-commerce as well, is the two terms outsourcing and offshoring, and they're two different things. Outsourcing is when you have other organizations do specific things for you. Typically, these are contract manufacturers. So you have them perform the manufacturing activities for you instead of having it done in your facility. Offshoring is a little bit different. In this case, you're outsourcing activities, from your organization to organizations in other countries. For example, you could offshore your purchasing department. So instead of purchasing agents being used in the United States, you have purchasing agents working for you in Europe. The most common example of offshoring, and the most frustrating in my mind, is technical support, where a lot of the technical support activities have been offshored to countries like India, where English is a second language. In fact, I just had a rather frustrating interchange with a technical support person this morning. And as I tried to politely inform them that while I appreciate that English is not their not their primary language, that the sentence she was stating to me made no sense. It was grammatically, I had no idea what she was trying to, to say in her words. They made no sense in English. So anyhow, but that's what offshoring is, good and bad of it. So let's look at it a little bit just for a minute on purchasing. And you're kind of going, this is an e-commerce class. Why are we talking about purchasing? Well, depending upon what you're doing in e-commerce, you're probably involved in some degree with purchasing aspects. Whether you're a reseller or a manufacturer, you have to obtain certain things. So some of the basic things, that we know that purchasing involves is to identify and evaluate vendors. You have to choose who's got the best products and services for you and the best price and terms and so forth. You'll hear the term supply chain used a lot, and what supply chain really encompasses is everything involved in the process of making whatever product or service you're providing to your ultimate customers. What are all the various bits and pieces, from the raw materials all the way to subcomponents to finished assembly to the boxes that it gets put into? Everything that's involved in that, because the idea of the supply chain is, when you think of a chain, if you break one link in the chain fails. So the expression, the chain is only as good as its weakest link. That is true when we look at all the materials and services that are are necessary to make our product. Our supply chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And so it's a really important part of business whether it's traditional brick and mortar stores or e-commerce, that you understand your supply chain and where the vulnerabilities are. So in a traditional purchasing arrangement, the purchasing department has a spec for a component. They go out and they get bids and they buy it at the lowest possible price by the what's called a reverse auction, where you put it out there and say, who wants to sell me this item? And one person says, I'll sell it to you for $10 a piece. The next person says, well, I'll sell it for $9.50 a piece. And then someone says, well, I'll sell it for $9 each. And so over time, the price goes down, getting to the lowest possible price. There are some fundamental flaws with that approach in that oftentimes you get what you pay for. So if someone's able to offer you a lower price, is it because they're more efficient? Or are they cutting corners? Is it a lesser quality than what the competitor proposed? That may be sufficient quality for you, or it may not. And so always going to the lowest price is not necessarily the smartest choice. Sometimes the best choice might actually be the most expensive choice. But in a traditional purchasing environment, all they're doing is driving costs down without regards to other aspects, quality, delivery, reliability, and so forth, taken into account. As I mentioned before, managing all these supplier relationships, this is supply chain management, really important part, especially as a startup. If you're a startup company, you're so focused on trying to grow the business, it's an easy one to overlook and not to take care of your supply chain. The last bullet point here, e-sourcing, is the most common now because of the advent of the internet. Is so easy to shop on a global basis, looking for where's the best place to get the particular components, subassemblies that you're looking for, or the best support staff that you're looking for if you're outsourcing some. So really most of what happens today is over the web, what would be called e-sourcing. And I think it's a fair assumption, or fair statement, what the author has said, that business purchasing process is more complex than most consumer purchasing processes. As consumers, we tend to be more emotional driven, spur of the moment, sometimes very simple. Is it the size television I'm looking for at the price I want? Done. Whereas in the business purchasing process, we have a lot more involved. It's the terms of the agreement. Is the vendor a stable supplier? We're looking into their financials to see. I don't want to get all set up with this vendor and supplying me parts and then to find out that next week they can't make shipments because they're bankrupt, and then I have to go out and find another vendor. So it's a much more complex when we're doing it, because we're looking at a long-term relationship, where consumer purchasing, for the most part, we go in and make a purchase. We're not so concerned, is that company going to be out of business tomorrow? Is that store going to be in business tomorrow? That's not nearly as important to us as consumers as to businesses. The concept of managing the spend that you have with a vendor is important. Certainly, it's part of your cost structure, so it affects your overall profitability. But it's also important to know how much of your purchases that you're making are going to which vendors, and how big a customer are you to them. If you're the majority of their business, you have a lot of clout with that customer to negotiate. If you're a small player, as far as that vendor is concerned, you don't have as much leverage. So it's one of those things you need to know that, understand what your relationship is. And the author mentions here, and I just mentioned briefly, the Institute for Supply Management. If you see that term, ISM, it's, just that organization for purchasing agents. No particular significance, just be aware of that term. So again, as we said, supply chain management's a job of managing everything that's going on. And really, the key here is that you want to achieve higher quality or lower cost product at the end of the chain. Or in my case, I would say achieve higher quality and lower cost product at the end of the chain. Certainly one of the aspects of when you say, is this a high quality product, is does it meet the target customer's price expectations and provide us as a company the revenue that we're looking for. But really, the reason to focus on supply chain is that you want to provide the best to the customer and the best to your company. So looking at value creation in the supply chain, as mentioned before, it really helps you take cost out. The just-in-time concept, which we go into much more detail, as I mentioned earlier in 101 and 131, really focuses on this idea that I don't want to have a warehouse full of components gathering dust waiting to be used by my manufacturing facility. Ideally, I would like to receive the parts just before I need them on my assembly manufacturing floor so that I have a very small warehouse. And so that really can take some of the cost out, because warehouse space is not free. Besides the building and the land that you're paying for, you also have this nifty little government idea called inventory tax, where you have to pay a tax on the raw materials that you have sitting in your inventory waiting to be consumed. So there's a lot of reasons to not have more than you need on hand. Plus there's also the time value of money. You don't want to tie up your capital with components that you aren't going to need for 6 months or 9 months or a year. And interesting that the author puts it in here that the whole supply chain and everything was developed as a way to reduce cost. But it really does add benefits to the ultimate consumer. By driving cost out, it can reduce the price to the consumer. But it also means that our manufacturing companies, the companies we want to buy things from, are more stable in that they're less likely to be impacted by a problem in their supply chain that causes them to be without product. So it really has benefited us in having more consistent availability of the ultimate product to the customers. Now, of course, there are unforeseen issues like the earthquake and tsunami that happened in Japan a few years ago that affected the nuclear power plant at Fukushima. That caused a great disruption in the supply chain for some particular integrated circuits that were used in the automotive industry. And it did impact the availability of some models of vehicles for a period of time. But generally speaking, our supply chain management has made it for a much more stable and consistent availability of products. Now, the nice thing that I like about this, the author is pointing out long-term relationships with a small number of suppliers. If we're constantly changing our supplier, every week because we can get it for a penny cheaper, that's really not an efficient and effective use of our purchasing agent's time and things. So there really is a balance there of some key tier 1 customer suppliers that we want to develop that long-term relationship with. The reason is, this one I had to deal with a lot in my corporate career, where the buyers expect to get annual price reductions. Just like our customers, the ultimate customers expect price to go down over time. For the most part, that's the expectation. There's very few things that we tolerate and accept that can go up in price as time goes on. Certainly, electronic devices, we expect them year over year to be less expensive or to have more features added for the same price, which is essentially the same thing as a price reduction. And so that's one of the things that we have to manage in our supply chain, because people that are buying from us, if we're selling to another business, are going to expect annual price reductions just like consumers do. So we have to find a way to still make money at a lower price year over year. Very seldom are you able to get a price increase. Like I said, there's very few industries where everyone accepts the fact that they cost more every year. Ironically, one of them are automobiles. It seems everyone's okay with the fact that next year's model is going to cost more than last year's model. We've already talked about competitive advantage, and the key here, I think, is that again, one of the reasons we focus on supply chain management, especially in e-commerce, is market responsiveness. When we're dealing with e-commerce, and people and companies have the ability to choose from anywhere in the world, your competition are thousands, tens of thousands of different individuals, and the market is constantly changing. So with our supply chain, we have to be able to be nimble and respond to changes in the market. What do we do if the particular variation of our product, let's say our product that we provide is available in 10 different configurations, and the mix suddenly changes as to what people want? Can we respond quickly by managing our supply chain to be able to produce the version that people are asking for, or do we go out of stock? A lot of times, especially if you're dealing with a consumer product, if you're out of stock, the consumer will not wait for you to come back in stock. Instead, they will go to your competition and see if they've got product available. And if it's almost as good as yours, that's good enough, because we've become an instant gratification society. So you cannot ever afford to be out of stock for very long. We're talking about a few days, not a few months. I like this point, that with the supply chain, clear communications and quick response. In one of my previous corporate roles, I constantly monitored the orders that my customer was placing, and when I would see something that looked out of the ordinary, and my customers had seasonality based on the particular market they were in and what their fiscal year, if you look at companies with their fiscal years, the last month of the year, they normally cut way back on purchasing of items to make the end of year numbers look better. But then after the first of the year, you get a lot of orders coming in to make up for all the stuff that they really should have ordered, but they didn't want to mess up with the books. And it's and so you learn that, and you establish what's the normal ordering pattern for my customer. But I would monitor those, and when I would see something out of the ordinary, I would pick up the phone and I would call my contact at the company and say, hey, I noticed that you're ordering more of these than normal. What's the story? And sometimes they would say, yeah, we did a new marketing campaign, and boy, it's just working great. And so we need to get more of those in. Okay, great. I can have my facility ramp up. But some of the times when I called them, they would say, oh no, that is completely wrong. We've got a problem in our forecasting system right now. Please disregard that. Let's put in a much lower order. We know that quantity is wrong. So it's the idea of clear communications and a quick response. I was responding immediately after seeing that order come in and saying, is this correct? And again, this idea of leveraging technology to quickly respond. I was leveraging technology in the way that I had databases of historical ordering patterns and everything else that I could call up and look at. You know, there's a lot of tools today, dashboards and other things that can monitor things real time and can help identify to you anything that looks out of the ordinary. So certainly that's using the internet and web technologies. One of the things I did in the early days of the internet was set up a private network with my major customers so that they could see what inventory levels we had on hand of items that they might want, and it really facilitated better communications between us. And as the author points out here, companies like Boeing, and when you think about Boeing, there are hundreds of thousands, I would say probably 1 million or more individual pieces in each aircraft that is produced. Incredibly complex assemblies to manufacture. And that's true. Cars have hundreds of thousands of individual components in them. You have to leverage technology to keep track of all of that, with everything from the design to the building of it. Have these particular new items, components being used in this design been validated through life cycle testing and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity involved in these larger devices that really, without technology, it'd be hard to imagine how it could be done. Now, one of the things that we use technology for a lot, from simple products to complex problems, is that we have to keep track of them as they move from one point to the next. I love the fact now that with UPS and other shipments, I can look at my shipment and I can see where is it right now today. And in the past, the main way of doing that was through barcodes. And with barcodes, you scan it as it comes into each particular point. This can be within your manufacturing facility, within your factory. As it moves from one station to the next, it gets scanned into the system so you can know and see, okay, this subassembly, where is it in the manufacturing process in my facility? Some manufacturing facilities are rather large. It's not like you can just go down to the floor and take a look and get a snapshot and know where everything's at. When I visited IBM Poughkeepsie, they had bicycles in the manufacturing facility so that you could get from one end to the other. It was such a huge facility. And so being able to monitor those electronically as they go from one station to the next in your manufacturing facility is beneficial, as well as when it goes to a vendor, when it goes out for delivery. So being able to have that is great. Now, barcodes have been very useful, but they're also limited. They have just a finite amount of information they can contain. A part number, a serial number, a shipping number. And in fact, here's an example where you have multiple barcodes on a label that's on a particular part that's going. And of course, to scan that in, you're having to scan each barcode one at a time to get to be recognized into the system. A much better way of doing that is through RFID. RFID was introduced, I want to say the first time I saw it was the early 90s. And it's the idea of saying, let's take technology and let's put a whole bunch of information into one little silicon chip, and we can have lot code information, data manufacturer, uh, what facility it was produced in, what its part number is, all kinds of information. We don't have the limitations that barcodes did in terms of the number of digits and characters that you can effectively have with a barcode. With an RFID device, it's virtually unlimited. So if you have a battery or something powering it, then it'll be an active RFID ID. But of course, the problem there is what happens when the battery, the power source, dies. Then you don't have access to that information anymore. What is most prevalent that you'll see is called passive RFID tags. They're inexpensive and very small, and the way it works, because you go, well, how does the little silicon chip needs power to transmit the information to your scanner? Where does the power come from? The RFID actually gets its power from the scanner that is scanning it. When you scan, what you're doing is transmitting a radio frequency signal to the RFID chip, which receives the request, and then it replies back. It is using the energy contained in that initial scan communication to temporarily power the RFID. It's a really neat little technology to where you're asking for the information from the RFID chip, and in the process of asking it, you're also giving it just enough power so that it can respond back with the information it needs. And one of the key aspects of RFID is, again, you want to reduce the lost sales that you have when you're out of stock. So if you have better tracking of your material, where it is in the supply chain, you can identify where you have potential problems, and you can say, we need to run the assembly line a few extra hours this weekend to get caught back up, so that you're managing that supply chain. It can really help you with that. The other thing that it really does is it benefits you with inventory control. I think I've got 100 pieces on the floor in my store. Do I have 100 pieces? Unfortunately, shoplifting is an issue. If our inventory system says there's 100, it's probably not true. We'd probably find that there's 99 or 98, or there might be 102 because somehow something didn't get done right. Someone at checkout made a mistake or whatever. With the RFID, you can inventory an entire store in a matter of just a few hours by just walking up and down the aisles and instantly gathering all that information. So it does really benefit in a number of ways in business, and we're seeing it a lot now. And a lot of times you will never even be aware that there's an RFID chip sewn in the hem of that shirt or embedded into the sole of that shoe. You'll never know it's there. And so that's really, as the author says here, it's widespread. And again, you don't even realize it because as a consumer, you don't even need to know. It does raise some privacy issue concerns, however, which is a whole nother topic that we get into in BA 131. RFID chip part is, if you see this little square here, that's the RFID chip. All this other stuff around here is the antenna. That's just wire. And actually, a lot of the RFID chips I've seen are much smaller than what is shown here. This one really has a very large antenna for some reason. But they're making them smaller and smaller all the time. as I say, they're putting them in hems of garments and other things, and you never know that they're even there. The biggest issue you have with your supply chain management and those long-term relationships is developing the trust. Just like virtually anything in life, it takes time to build trust, but it's essential when you're dealing with a supply chain to really have vendors that trust each other and work together. So I like what the author said. Key elements are communication and information sharing. And I especially like that adjective in the front there, continual communication. Again, that's like I was saying in the example earlier. When I picked up the phone and called my customer and says, "Hey, I see your orders are up. What's going on?" You know, it's that idea that we're in constant, continual communication. We're in sync with each other. And certainly the internet and web provide very easy or much easier ways of doing that than in the past. Okay, password for quiz number 5 is RFID. And again, if you don't have a paper, pen, or pencil handy, just press pause right now on the video. You will need this in order to be able to take quiz number 5. And remember, you have to take each chapter quiz before you will have access to the assignments for that week. And unfortunately, the assignments don't even show up on your calendar until you have taken the quiz, and then they will be there. If you're ever in doubt what's due each week, go to the course calendar on the top nav bar. If you click on that, open up the PDF that I've created, it shows you what assignments are due each week. But just make sure you take the chapter quiz and you'll be fine. So with that, we're done with chapter 5.